Nurse defends the doctor's mother, and what he does next is shocking. Megan Mitchell never imagined that Tuesday morning would completely change her life and everyone else's at St. Jude Medical Center in Indianapolis. After 12 years dedicating her life to patients, she thought she had seen it all, but she was about to find out that some battles are worth more than her job itself. It was the shrill scream that made her run down the hallway. Turning the corner, Megan saw a scene that made her blood boil. A blonde woman, elegantly dressed in an expensive red dress, was yelling at an elderly lady with white hair who was trembling, leaning on her walker. "Stop this ridiculous act," the blonde woman shouted, gesturing aggressively. "You're just a spoiled old woman pretending to have dementia to get attention. Everyone here knows you're perfectly capable of taking care of yourself." The old woman just babbled confused words, her hands shaking on the walker's handles. Tears streamed down her wrinkled face as she tried to explain herself. I just wanted my medicine. It's time." "Medicine?" The blonde woman laughed scornfully. "You take too much medicine. It's a waste of public money." Megan couldn't hold back. Her feet moved on their own until she positioned herself between the two women, extending her arm to protect the elderly lady. "Excuse me," Megan said, trying to keep her voice calm despite the anger she felt. "Can you explain to me what's going on here?" The blonde woman stared at her with cold, icy eyes. She was clearly younger than Megan, probably around 40, and carried a leather briefcase indicating some important position. "Who are you to interfere?" she replied harshly. "I'm Victoria Vance, the new administrative director of this hospital, and you're just some nurse who should mind your own business." "I'm Nurse Megan Mitchell," she answered firmly, "and my business is taking care of the patients in this institution. You can't treat an elderly woman like that." Victoria narrowed her eyes. Megan noticed she wore a gold wedding ring and had a demeanor that suggested someone used to giving orders and being obeyed. "This old woman," Victoria pointed at the elderly lady as if she were an object, "is faking confusion to get expensive, unnecessary medications. I've already cut several superfluous treatments for her and other patients. This hospital needs financial organization, not sentimentality." The elderly lady tried to speak again, but the words came out garbled. Megan realized the woman was genuinely confused and scared. "My son. Where is my son? He's a doctor here." At that moment, rapid footsteps echoed down the hallway. A man in a white coat came running, his face pale and eyes wide. Megan recognized him immediately. It was Dr. Simon Harrison, one of the most respected doctors at the hospital. Everyone expected him to defend his mother, to put Victoria in her place. But what happened left Megan utterly shocked. Simon abruptly stopped when he saw who was yelling at his mother and stood completely frozen, as if he had seen a ghost. "Victoria," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Oh, finally," Victoria exclaimed with a cruel smile. "Dr. Simon, I need to speak with you about your mother, and also about this disrespectful nurse who is meddling in administrative matters." Simon looked at Megan, then at his mother, and finally at Victoria. His hands trembled slightly. "Megan, please, let me handle this," he said, his voice weak. Megan couldn't believe what she was hearing. Dr. Simon had always been a brave man who defended his patients and staff. Why was he acting so strangely? "Doctor, with all due respect," said Megan, keeping her voice steady, "your mother needs medical care, not shouting and humiliation." Victoria stomped her foot, the sound echoing down the hallway. "Enough," she shouted. "Nurse Mitchell, you are immediately suspended for contempt of authority, and if you keep meddling, I'll sue both you and this hospital." "You can't do that," Megan protested. "Oh, I can. I'm the administrative director, and I have full authority to make disciplinary decisions." Victoria opened her folder and pulled out some papers. "Actually, your suspension isn't even for insubordination. It's for professional incompetence." "What do you mean?" Megan felt the world spin around her. "I've received reports about your irregular conduct, medications given off schedule, unauthorized procedures, unnecessary expenses on patients." Victoria read the papers with cruel satisfaction. "You're costing this hospital too much money." "That's a lie," Megan burst out. "I've always followed every protocol." Simon remained silent, his eyes on the floor. His mother, Mrs. Martha, tried to approach him. "Simon, My son. Help me. Mother, please go to your room, he said, without meeting her eyes. Megan felt her heart break. How could a son treat his own mother that way, especially when she clearly needed help? Dr. Simon, Megan said, trying one last time, your mother, Mrs. Martha, is asking for help. As a doctor, you can't ignore this. Nurse Mitchell is right, Mrs. Martha whispered, her words coming out clearer for a moment. I need my medication. I'm feeling so confused. Victoria laughed with contempt. See? When it suits her, she speaks perfectly fine. It's all an act to get attention and expensive medication. That was when Megan made a decision that would change everything. She knelt beside Mrs. Martha and gently held her hands. Mrs. Martha, would you like me to accompany you to your room? I can check your medications and see if everything is in order. You will do nothing, Victoria shouted. You are suspended. My suspension only counts if signed by the medical director, Megan replied, standing up. And as far as I know, that hasn't happened yet. Then I'll take care of that right now. Victoria grabbed her cell phone and dialed a number. Hello, Dr. Bennett. I need you to come to the 3rd floor immediately. We have an insubordinate employee who needs to be fired. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to hit like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now, continuing. Megan helped Mrs. Martha walk to her room, ignoring Victoria's protests. The room was simple but comfortable, with a bed, an armchair and a small table with some of the elderly woman's personal belongings. Mrs. Martha, Megan said softly, can you show me your medications? The elderly woman pointed with trembling fingers to a drawer. Megan opened it and found several bottles of medication. As she examined the labels, she became confused. Some of the medications were for conditions she didn't know Mrs. Martha had. Mrs. Martha, who prescribed these medications for you? The woman sat down on the bed with difficulty, her eyes filling with tears. I don't know. The blonde woman. She said it was for my own good. But ever since I started taking them, I get so confused. A chill ran down Megan's spine. She examined the medications more closely. There was a strong sedative medication that should not be given to elderly patients without strict medical supervision. Mrs. Martha, do you remember when you started taking these medications? About 2 weeks ago, when the blonde woman arrived. She said my son agreed. Megan took out her phone and discreetly photographed the medication bottles. Something was very wrong here. Why would Victoria be prescribing medication? She was an administrator, not a doctor. Mrs. Martha, you were a teacher, weren't you? The elderly woman's eyes lit up for a moment, as if a fog had lifted. I was a history professor at the university. I taught for 40 years. She paused, confused again. But now I can't remember things. Am I getting sick? You're not sick, Megan said gently. I think you're taking medicine you shouldn't be. At that moment, the door swung open abruptly. Dr. Simon walked in, his face red with anger. Megan, what do you think you're doing? He asked, closing the door behind him. I'm taking care of your mother, Doctor. Someone needs to. You don't understand the situation, he said, running his hands through his hair. You need to stop getting involved. Getting involved in what? In caring for an elderly woman who's being mistreated? Simon stepped closer, lowering his voice. Megan, you don't know who you're dealing with. Victoria isn't just the administrative director. She has the power to ruin anyone's career in this hospital. So what? Megan replied. That doesn't give her the right to mistreat your mother. You don't understand. Simon exploded, then immediately lowered his voice again. She knows things about me, about a case that happened years ago. What kind of things? Simon looked at his mother, who seemed to be dozing in bed, then turned his eyes back to Megan. 5 years ago, I made a medical error. A patient had complications because of a decision I made. The case was covered up, but Victoria has all the documents. And she's blackmailing you? Not just me. She has compromising information on several staff members. That's how she gets whatever she wants without anyone questioning it. Megan felt a mix of anger and pity. Simon was being manipulated. But that didn't justify abandoning his own mother. "Doctor, regardless of what she knows, your mother needs help. Look at these medications." She showed the bottles. "Your mother is taking sedatives that could be causing her confusion." Simon examined the bottles, his face turning pale. "I didn't prescribe these. Who authorized these medications?" "According to your mother, it was Victoria herself. But she's not a doctor. How can she prescribe medication? That's exactly what I'm trying to find out." Mrs. Martha opened her eyes, appearing more alert. "Simon? My son?" She reached out her hand to him. "Why don't you come visit me anymore?" Simon hesitated, then stepped closer and took his mother's hand. "I do come, Mom. I've just been very busy." "I know. You've always been so dedicated. Just like your father." Mrs. Martha's eyes filled with tears. "But sometimes I need you. I feel so lost." "Mom." Simon swallowed hard. "Why are you feeling confused?" "After I started taking the new medications, it's like my head is always in a fog, and sometimes I get strange pains in my arms." Megan exchanged an alarmed look with Simon. "What kind of pains, Mrs. Martha?" "Like someone squeezed me hard. It leaves purple marks." Simon carefully lifted his mother's sleeve. There were dark marks around her wrist, clearly from someone gripping her tightly. "My God," Simon murmured. "Who did this to you, Mom?" "I don't remember well. Someone held me down when I didn't want to take the medicine. Said it was for my own good." Megan felt a wave of nausea. Someone was forcing Mrs. Martha to take medication and using physical violence to do it. "Dr. Simon, we need to report this immediately," Megan said. "To who?" Simon asked bitterly. "Victoria controls the entire administration, and the medical director does whatever she says." "Then we'll find another way." At that moment the door opened again. Victoria entered, accompanied by 2 security guards and an older man in a white coat. "Dr. Bennett," said Victoria with a fake smile. "As you can see, Nurse Megan Mitchell continues to disobey direct orders. I need immediate action to be taken." Dr. Bennett, the medical director of the hospital, looked uncomfortable. "Megan, you were instructed to step away. Why are you still here?" "Dr. Bennett," Megan replied, "I discovered serious irregularities in the treatment of Mrs. Martha. She is being medicated with unauthorized substances by an unqualified person." "That's absurd," exclaimed Victoria. "This woman is making up lies to divert attention from her own incompetence." "Then examine the medications," challenged Megan, showing the vials. Dr. Bennett took the vials and examined the labels. His expression gradually shifted from irritation to concern. "Victoria, can you explain why a patient is receiving a strong sedative medication without a medical prescription?" Victoria stammered for a moment. "Dr. Simon authorized the treatment." "No, I did not authorize it," said Simon, finally finding the courage to speak up. "Of course you did," insisted Victoria, but her voice was less steady. "You signed the paperwork last week." "Show me that paperwork," demanded Dr. Bennett. "Oh." Victoria opened her folder with slightly trembling hands and took out some documents. Megan watched closely as Dr. Bennett examined the papers. "This signature," Dr. Bennett looked at Simon. "Is this really your signature?" Simon examined the document. "It looks like my handwriting, but I don't remember signing this." "Selective memory," Victoria remarked sharply. "Doctors sign so many documents a day that they don't even remember." "Dr. Bennett," Megan interrupted, "there's one more thing. Mrs. Martha has marks of physical violence on her arms." "What?" Dr. Bennett turned to examine Mrs. Martha. "It's nothing," Victoria said quickly. "Elderly people have fragile skin. Any touch leaves a mark." But Dr. Bennett was examining Mrs. Martha's arms, and his expression grew increasingly serious. "These aren't marks from fragile skin," he said. "These are restraint marks. Someone held this lady with enough force to cause bruises." "Doctor," Megan said, "Mrs. Martha told me someone forced her to take the medication when she refused." "That's a very serious accusation," said Dr. Bennett, looking directly at Victoria. "And completely unfounded," replied Victoria, but Megan noticed she was sweating. "This nurse is clearly trying to create a situation to divert attention from her own problems." "Then let's clear all this up properly," said Dr. Bennett. "I'm going to request a full investigation." "An investigation?" Victoria laughed, but the sound was forced. "Dr. Bennett, I remind you that I have administrative authority to make decisions about problematic employees, and this nurse is clearly a problem." "Your administrative authority does not include medicating patients," Dr. Bennett replied firmly, "nor does it allow physical violence against the elderly." "I never used violence against anyone." "Then how do you explain the marks on Mrs. Martha's arms?" "I don't need to explain anything," said Victoria, her tone becoming more aggressive. "You're questioning my authority based on the fantasies of an incompetent employee." "My mother is not a fantasy," said Simon, finally taking a stand. "And these marks are real." Victoria looked at Simon with eyes full of anger. "Simon, you are making a very serious mistake," she said, her voice low and threatening. "Remember what we talked about, certain situations from the past." "What situations from the past?" asked Dr. Bennett. Simon hesitated, looking at Victoria, then at his mother and finally at Megan. It was as if something inside him had broken. "Dr. Bennett," said Simon, his voice trembling, "I need to confess something. 5 years ago, I made a medical error that resulted in complications for a patient. Victoria found out and has been using that information to blackmail me." "Simon, shut your mouth," Victoria hissed. "I'm not going to stay quiet anymore," Simon continued. "She threatened me, saying that if I didn't cooperate, she'd expose the case and destroy my career. That's why I've been letting her do whatever she wants with my mother." Dr. Bennett looked at Victoria in shock. "Is that true?" "It's his word against mine," Victoria replied, but her posture was defensive. "Doctor," said Megan, "I photographed the medications. I can prove that Mrs. Martha was receiving unauthorized substances." "You photographed medical documents without authorization?" Victoria attacked. "That's a violation of patient privacy." "I photographed them to protect the patient," Megan replied, "and as the nurse responsible for her care, I have a duty to document irregularities." Dr. Bennett seemed to be processing all the information. "Victoria, I'm going to ask that you temporarily step away from your duties until this situation is clarified." "You don't have the authority to do that," Victoria replied. "I report directly to the administrative board." "And the administrative board needs to know about these allegations," said Dr. Bennett. "Great," Victoria said with a cruel smile. "Let's see who they'll believe. A competent director trying to organize this hospital, or problematic employees making up stories to protect themselves?" She turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "Oh, and Megan," she said, turning around, "your termination is already being processed. By the end of the week, you won't be working here anymore." After Victoria left, the room fell silent. Mrs. Martha had fallen asleep during the argument, apparently exhausted by the stress. "Megan," said Dr. Bennett, "I need you to document everything you've discovered. We're going to need solid evidence if we want to do anything." "Doctor, I can do more than document," said Megan. "I can investigate." "What do you mean?" "Victoria couldn't have done all this alone. Someone else must be involved, and if she's doing this to Mrs. Martha, she might be doing it to other patients too." Simon approached his sleeping mother and gently touched her face. "Megan is right," he said. "My mother was always a strong, intelligent woman. Seeing her like this, confused, scared, it's not natural." "So what do you propose?" asked Dr. Bennett. "That I continue taking care of Mrs. Martha, but now pay attention to everything happening around her," Megan replied, "and that we investigate whether other patients are going through the same situation." "But Victoria will try to stop that," said Simon. "Leave Victoria to me," said Dr. Bennett. "For now she still answers to the board, but the board also answers to the medical director in matters involving patient care." "And what if she actually manages to fire me?" asked Megan. Dr. Bennett smiled for the first time. "Megan, in 12 years working here, you've never had a single formal complaint. Your record is flawless. It'll be hard for her to prove incompetence." "But she said she has reports." "Reports that no one but her has seen," Dr. Bennett interrupted. "We'll examine those documents very carefully." That night, Megan returned home to her small apartment in the suburbs of Indianapolis. She had been living alone since she separated from her husband 3 years earlier, and she supported the 2 children who lived with him in another city. While heating up a simple dinner, she couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Martha. The elderly woman reminded her of her own grandmother, who had been a beloved teacher in her hometown before she passed away. Megan picked up her phone and researched the medications Mrs. Martha was taking. What she discovered left her even more worried. The strong sedative medication, when misused, could cause exactly the symptoms Mrs. Martha was showing: mental confusion, disorientation, and excessive drowsiness. But why would Victoria do that? What reason would she have to drug a harmless elderly woman? The next morning, Megan arrived at the hospital, determined to uncover the truth. She went straight to Mrs. Martha's room and found the lady more alert than in previous days. "Megan," said Mrs. Martha with a smile, "how nice that you came. I'm feeling a bit better today. Did you take the medications this morning?" "No. No one has brought them yet. Maybe they forgot." Megan suspected it wasn't forgetfulness. Probably Dr. Bennett had instructed that unauthorized medications be suspended. "Mrs. Martha, do you mind if I ask a few questions?" "Of course not, dear." "Do you remember when you started feeling confused?" Mrs. Martha thought for a moment. "It was right after that blonde woman arrived at the hospital. She said she had new treatments that would help me feel better." "And what else did she say?" "That my son was very worried about me and had asked her to personally handle my case." Mrs. Martha paused, a doubtful expression on her face. "But now that I think about it, Simon had never mentioned her before. Do you remember anything else strange that happened?" "Well." Mrs. Martha lowered her voice as if to tell a secret. "She always insisted on being alone with me when she administered the medications, and if I refused or questioned her, she would get very angry." "Angry how?" "Once she grabbed my arm tightly and said that if I didn't cooperate, my son would lose his job. I was so scared I didn't want to harm Simon." Megan felt anger growing inside her. Victoria had used a mother's love for her son to manipulate and mistreat her. "Mrs. Martha, do you keep any personal documents here at the hospital?" "Yes, I do. I have a small folder with some important papers in the drawer of that table over there." Megan opened the drawer and found a red leather folder, well preserved despite the years. Inside were diplomas, certificates of recognition for academic excellence, and some old photographs. "Wow, Mrs. Martha, you have an impressive resume," said Megan, examining the documents. "It was a different time," sighed Mrs. Martha. "When I had purpose, when I felt I was making a difference in the world." "You still make a difference," said Megan affectionately. "Look, you were a teacher for 40 years, supervised dozens of master's and doctoral students, published 3 books on American history." "Have you read my books?" asked Mrs. Martha, her eyes shining. "Not yet, but I intend to." Megan continued examining the documents when something caught her attention. "Mrs. Martha, what is this?" It was an old photo of Mrs. Martha at a graduation ceremony, next to a young man who looked familiar. "Ah, that photo." Mrs. Martha smiled. "It was from the graduation of one of my favorite students. He was very dedicated, always stayed after class to ask extra questions." Megan looked more closely at the photo. The young man had something familiar, but she couldn't identify what. "What was his name?" "Arthur. Arthur Bennett." Megan almost dropped the photo. Arthur Bennett. "Dr. Bennett." "Mrs. Martha, have you known Dr. Bennett for a long time?" "Of course, he was my student at the university. Then he did his medical residency and always sent me Christmas cards. A lovely boy." "Does he know you are a retired teacher?" "I think so." "Why wouldn't he?" Megan was beginning to understand some details of the situation. Dr. Menezes conhecia Dona Helena pessoalmente, sabia de sua importância acadêmica. Isso explicava por que ele havia levado as acusações contra Patrícia a sério. "Dona Helena, a senhora se importa se eu mostrar estas fotos para o Dr. Menezes?" "Claro que não, querida. Será que ele vai se lembrar de mim?" Nesse momento, a porta se abriu e uma auxiliar de enfermagem entrou carregando uma bandeja com medicamentos. "Bom dia, Dona Helena", disse a auxiliar alegremente. "Trouxe seus remédios da manhã." Carla examinou os medicamentos na bandeja. Eram completamente diferentes dos que Dona Helena estava tomando antes. Com licença, disse Carla para a auxiliar. Posso ver a prescrição destes medicamentos? A auxiliar, que Carla reconheceu como sendo Fernanda, uma funcionária competente, mostrou o papel. É uma nova prescrição do Dr. Ricardo, de ontem à noite. Ele suspendeu todos os medicamentos anteriores e prescreveu apenas vitaminas e um suplemento para a memória. Que bom, disse Carla, aliviada. Depois que Fernanda saiu, Dona Helena tomou seus novos medicamentos sem reclamações. Carla, disse ela, posso te pedir um favor? Claro, Dona Helena. Você pode levar essas fotos para o Paulo. Quer dizer, Dr. Menezes, acho que ele gostaria de vê-las. Carla pegou as fotos e se dirigiu ao consultório de Dr. Menezes. Ao bater na porta, ouviu uma voz familiar autorizando sua entrada. Dr. Menezes, disse Carla, trouxe algo que pode interessar ao senhor. Ela mostrou as fotos. O rosto de Dr. Menezes se iluminou imediatamente. Meu Deus, Dona Helena? Ele pegou as fotos com cuidado como se fossem tesouros. Ela foi uma das melhores professoras que já tive. Rígida, exigente, mas absolutamente brilhante. Por que o senhor não me disse que conhecia ela pessoalmente? Porque até ontem eu não havia feito a conexão. Dr. Menezes se sentou em sua cadeira ainda olhando as fotos. Helena Fernandes. Professora Helena. Claro, o sobrenome é igual ao do Ricardo porque ela é a mãe dele. O senhor a conheceu como professora? Ela foi minha orientadora de iniciação científica quando eu ainda estava decidindo entre medicina e história. Me ensinou a pesquisar, a questionar, a nunca aceitar informações sem verificar as fontes. Dr. Menezes parou, uma expressão de raiva passando por seu rosto. E aquela mulher teve a audácia de drogar uma das mentes mais brilhantes que já conheci. Doutor, tenho uma teoria sobre o que está acontecendo, disse Carla. Fale. Patrícia não está fazendo isso apenas com Dona Helena. Acho que ela está aplicando um esquema sistemático de redução de custos através de medicação inadequada de pacientes idosos. Continue. Pense bem. Ela droga os pacientes para deixá-los confusos e dóceis. Assim, eles reclamam menos, ficam mais fáceis de controlar. E ela pode cortar gastos com tratamentos e medicamentos sem muita resistência. Dr. Menezes se inclinou para a frente, interessado. E por que ela escolheu Dona Helena especificamente? Porque Dona Helena é inteligente e articulada. Mesmo confusa pela medicação, ela ainda faz perguntas e questiona as coisas. Patrícia viu isso como uma ameaça. Faz sentido, murmurou o Dr. Menezes. Doutor, eu gostaria de investigar outros pacientes da ala geriátrica. Tenho quase certeza de que vamos encontrar mais casos similares. Carla, isso pode ser perigoso. Se Patrícia descobrir o que você está fazendo, ela já quer me demitir mesmo, disse Carla. Não tenho nada a perder. Dr. Menezes ficou em silêncio por um momento, pensando. Está bem, disse ele finalmente. Mas vamos fazer isso oficialmente. Vou autorizar uma auditoria médica da ala geriátrica. Você vai ser minha assistente nessa auditoria. E se Patrícia tentar impedir? Deixe ela comigo, disse Dr. Menezes com um sorriso determinado. Professora Helena me ensinou a questionar a autoridade quando necessário. Está na hora de usar essa lição. Translation. Bennett knew Mrs. Martha personally, knew her academic importance. That explained why he had taken the accusations against Victoria seriously. Mrs. Martha, do you mind if I show these photos to Dr. Bennett? Of course not, dear. Do you think he'll remember me? At that moment the door opened, and a nursing assistant entered carrying a tray of medications. Good morning, Mrs. Martha, said the assistant cheerfully. I brought your morning meds. Megan examined the medications on the tray. They were completely different from what Mrs. Martha had been taking before. Excuse me, Megan said to the assistant. May I see the prescription for these medications? The assistant, whom Megan recognized as Heather, a competent employee, showed her the paper. It's a new prescription from Dr. Simon, from last night. He discontinued all previous medications and prescribed only vitamins and a memory supplement. That's great, said Megan, relieved. After Heather left, Mrs. Martha took her new medications without complaint. "Megan," she said, "can I ask you a favor?" "Of course, Mrs. Martha." "Could you take these photos to Arthur? I mean Dr. Bennett? I think he'd like to see them." Megan took the photos and headed to Dr. Bennett's office. Knocking on the door, she heard a familiar voice giving her permission to enter. "Dr. Bennett," said Megan, "I brought something that might interest you." She showed the photos. Dr. Bennett's face lit up immediately. "My God, Mrs. Martha!" He took the photos carefully as if they were treasures. She was one of the best teachers I ever had. Tough, demanding, but absolutely brilliant. "Why didn't you tell me you knew her personally?" "Because until yesterday, I hadn't made the connection." Dr. Bennett sat in his chair, still looking at the photos. "Martha Miller, Professor Martha. Of course, the last name is the same as Simon's because she's his mother. You knew her as a professor. She was my undergraduate research advisor when I was still deciding between medicine and history. She taught me how to research, how to question, never to accept information without checking the sources." Dr. Bennett paused, an expression of anger crossing his face. "And that woman had the audacity to drug one of the brightest minds I've ever known." "Doctor, I have a theory about what's happening," said Megan. "Go on." "Victoria isn't doing this only to Mrs. Martha. I think she's implementing a systematic cost-cutting scheme through inappropriate medication of elderly patients." "Continue." "Think about it. She drugs patients to make them confused and docile. That way they complain less, are easier to control, and she can cut expenses on treatments and medications without much resistance." Dr. Bennett leaned forward, interested. "And why did she choose Mrs. Martha specifically?" "Because Mrs. Martha is smart and articulate. Even confused by the medication, she still asks questions and challenges things. Victoria saw that as a threat." "That makes sense," murmured Dr. Bennett. "Doctor, I'd like to investigate other patients in the geriatric ward. I'm pretty sure we'll find more similar cases." "Megan, this could be dangerous. If Victoria finds out what you're doing—" "She already wants to fire me anyway," said Megan. "I have nothing to lose." Dr. Bennett was silent for a moment, thinking. "All right," he said finally. "But we'll do this officially. I'm going to authorize a medical audit of the geriatric ward. You'll be my assistant on that audit. And if Victoria tries to stop it, leave her to me," said Dr. Bennett with a determined smile. "Professor Martha taught me to question authority when necessary. It's time to use that lesson." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to hit like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. That afternoon, Megan and Dr. Bennett began the medical audit. They visited each patient in the geriatric ward, examining charts and discreetly talking to other staff members. What they discovered was even worse than they had imagined. Of the 15 elderly patients admitted, 8 were receiving unauthorized medications or inappropriate dosages. All presented symptoms similar to Mrs. Martha's: confusion, drowsiness, and abnormal docility. "Dr. Bennett," said Megan, as they examined Mr. Thomas's chart, an 80-year-old man. "This patient was only admitted for cataract surgery. Why is he taking strong sedative medication?" "Good question," replied Dr. Bennett, examining the prescription. "And look here, the signature on the authorization form appears to be Dr. Simon's, but Dr. Simon is a cardiologist, not an ophthalmologist," Megan finished. "Exactly. He would have no reason to prescribe medication for a cataract patient." They continued the investigation and discovered a disturbing pattern. All the inappropriate medications had been authorized by different doctors at the hospital, but the prescriptions always appeared after administrative meetings led by Victoria. "Megan," said Dr. Bennett, "I think we've figured out how she's doing this." "How?" "She must be forging doctors' signatures, or worse, blackmailing doctors into signing prescriptions they didn't read properly. Like Dr. Simon." Like Dr. Simon. They were so focused on the investigation that they didn't notice when Victoria appeared at the door of the room where they were working. "Dr. Bennett," she said, her voice icy, May I ask what you're doing with my patient's charts? There are patients, Dr. Bennett corrected, and I'm conducting a routine medical audit. An unauthorized audit, Victoria replied. I should have been notified before any administrative review. This is not an administrative review, said Megan. It's a medical audit. The difference is important. Victoria looked at Megan with pure hatred. You should be at home, unemployed. Your termination was approved by the board this morning. Actually, it wasn't, said Dr. Bennett calmly. I spoke with the board chair an hour ago. They want to talk to you about some irregularities we've discovered. For the first time, Megan saw fear in Victoria's eyes. What kind of irregularities? Unauthorized medication of patients, possible forgery of medical documents, and reports of physical violence against the elderly, Dr. Bennett listed. That's ridiculous, said Victoria, but her voice was no longer steady. You're inventing accusations to protect incompetent employees. Then explain this, said Megan, showing the medication vials she had photographed. Why are cataract patients taking strong sedative medication? The attending doctors authorized these treatments. Doctors who aren't specialists in the conditions being treated, Dr. Bennett interrupted. And who don't remember signing those authorizations, added Megan. Victoria looked from one to the other, clearly searching for a way out. You have no proof of anything, she said finally. We have patient testimonies, the inappropriate medications, the suspicious signatures and the physical marks of violence, Dr. Bennett enumerated. The board considers that sufficient evidence for a formal investigation. The board is going to take your word over mine. Not just ours, said a voice from the door. It was Simon, accompanied by Heather, the nursing assistant, and 3 more staff members from the geriatric ward. Dr. Simon? Said Victoria, surprised. Victoria, I can't stay silent any longer, said Simon. These staff members came to me reporting similar situations with other patients. Heather stepped forward. I saw you forcing medication on Mrs. Esther when she refused. You held her arm so tightly it left marks. And I saw you altering dosages in medical records without consulting the responsible doctors, said another staff member. And I heard you threatening patients, saying that if they complained about the treatments, they would lose their spots at the hospital, added a third. Victoria looked around, surrounded by accusers. Her haughty posture was crumbling. You're organizing against me, she stammered. This is a conspiracy. This is justice, Simon said firmly. My mother spent weeks suffering because of my cowardice. I won't let this continue. Simon, you'll regret this, Victoria threatened. I still have information about you. I don't care anymore, Simon interrupted. I'd rather face the consequences of my mistakes than watch you keep mistreating helpless elderly people. Dr. Bennett stood up. Victoria Vance, on behalf of this hospital's medical board, you are suspended from all duties until a full investigation is conducted. You can't do this. Yes, we can. And we will, said Dr. Bennett. Megan, can you call security to escort the former director out? Megan couldn't hide a small smile of satisfaction as she picked up the phone. 2 days later, things began to return to normal at the hospital. The official investigation had started, and evidence kept emerging about Victoria's abuses. Megan was in Mrs. Martha's room, who was visibly better. Without the wrong medications, her mind was clearer, and her true personality was returning. Megan, said Mrs. Martha, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for me. You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Martha. It was my duty. It wasn't just duty, said the elderly woman, taking Megan's hand. It was courage. You risked your job, your career, to protect a stranger. You weren't a stranger, said Megan. You were a patient who needed help. Mrs. Martha smiled. You remind me of my best students, determined, brave, with a strong sense of justice. At that moment, Simon entered the room. Mom, how are you feeling today? Much better, my son. Mrs. Martha looked at him with affection, but also with seriousness. Simon, we need to talk about what happened. Simon sat down beside the bed. Mum, I'm so sorry. I should have protected you. You were being blackmailed, Mrs. Martha interrupted. I won't pretend I wasn't hurt, but I understand what you went through. Even so, there's no excuse for abandoning you when you needed me most." "Simon," said Mrs. Martha, using the teacherly tone Megan was beginning to recognize, "you made a mistake in the past. A serious medical error." Simon looked down. "Yes, a patient had complications because of a decision I made. He almost didn't survive." "Almost didn't survive, but he did survive." "Yes, he made a full recovery after emergency surgery." "And did you learn anything from that mistake?" "I learned. I completely changed the way I work. I never made a similar mistake again." "Then why are you so afraid of others knowing about it?" Simon thought for a moment. Because I'm afraid of judgment, of losing the trust of colleagues and patients." "My son," said Mrs. Martha gently, "I taught medicine for decades before retiring and switching to history. I can assure you there isn't a doctor in the world who has never made a mistake." "Mom, the difference between a good doctor and a terrible one isn't the absence of mistakes. It's what they do when they make them." "Did you hide your mistake or take responsibility?" "I took responsibility. I reported everything to my superiors, paid for additional treatment out of my own pocket, and implemented new protocols to prevent similar situations." "Then you acted like a good doctor," Mrs. Martha said firmly, "and anyone who judges you negatively for that doesn't deserve your concern." Megan watched the conversation, moved. Mrs. Martha was doing exactly what a good teacher does, turning a mistake into a learning experience. "Megan," Simon said, "I owe you an apology too." "Doctor—" "No, let me speak," Simon interrupted. "You did what I should have done from the start. You put my mother's well-being above personal convenience. You were in a tough situation. I was, but that doesn't justify my behavior." Simon turned to his mother. "Mum, can I make a proposal?" "Of course." "How about I start coming to visit you every day after work? We can have dinner together, talk about your day, your projects." "What projects?" Mrs. Martha asked, surprised. "Well, Dr. Bennett told me you were writing a book about local history before you got confused with the medication. How about picking that project back up?" Mrs. Martha's eyes lit up. "Do you think I still have the ability for that?" "Mom, you have a doctorate. You've published 3 books. You've mentored dozens of students. Of course you have the ability." "And," Megan added, "you can use your experience here at the hospital to include a chapter on the importance of humanized care in modern medicine." "That's a wonderful idea," Mrs. Martha said, animated for the first time in weeks. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. A week later, Dr. Bennett called Megan into his office. "Megan, I have news about the investigation. Good or bad?" "Very good," Dr. Bennett said with a smile. "The external audit confirmed all our suspicions. Victoria was indeed forging medical signatures and medicating patients inappropriately. And the other doctors she was blackmailing. We identified 5 doctors who were being manipulated similarly to Dr. Simon. All of them were brave enough to speak up after seeing him come forward." "That's good," Megan said, relieved. "But there's more," Dr. Bennett continued. "The investigation found that Victoria was embezzling funds from the hospital. The expensive medications she claimed she was saving were still being purchased, but they weren't reaching the patients. So she was stealing too. It seems so. The scheme was sophisticated. She would buy expensive medications, give patients cheap substitutes, and sell the original medications to private clinics." Megan was shocked. The situation was even worse than they had imagined. "What's going to happen to her?" "The case has been handed over to the authorities. She'll face charges for medical malpractice, fraud, embezzlement, and elder abuse." "And the hospital?" "The hospital will undergo a complete administrative overhaul and," Dr. Bennett smiled, "the board made an interesting decision about you." "About me?" "Megan Mitchell, you are being promoted to nursing supervisor of the geriatric ward, with a 40% salary increase and the authority to implement new protocols for humanized care." Megan felt tears in her eyes. "Dr. Bennett, I don't know what to say." "Say you accept," Dr. Bennett laughed, Because Mrs. Martha is already preparing a list of suggestions to improve elder care, and you'll need all the authority you can get to implement them. Is she really doing well? Better than well. She's back to research and writing. By the way, she wants to talk to you about something important. Megan went straight to Mrs. Martha's room, where she found the lady sitting at the table, surrounded by books and papers. She was wearing reading glasses and had a look of concentration she hadn't shown in weeks. "Mrs. Martha," Megan said cheerfully. "How's the book?" "Megan!" Mrs. Martha stood up and hugged the young nurse. "Come, I need to show you something." She led Megan to the table where several documents were spread out. "Remember when you asked me about important documents?" "I do. Well, when I started researching for my book, I discovered something interesting in the city's historical archives." Megan moved closer to the documents. "What is it?" "They're land donation records for the construction of this hospital, and look who the main donor was." Megan read the document and was surprised. "Professor Anthony Mitchell. Mitchell is my last name too." "That's right," said Mrs. Martha with a mysterious smile. "I decided to research your family as well, out of academic curiosity." "And what did you find out?" "Professor Anthony Mitchell was your great-grandfather. He donated most of the funds and the land for the construction of this hospital in 1952. Megan was speechless. "My great-grandfather helped build this hospital?" "He didn't just help," said Mrs. Martha. "He was the main person responsible. He was a doctor and a professor, and he dreamed of a hospital that would provide humane care for people from all social classes. That's why the hospital is called St. Jude. St. Jude, patron saint of hopeless causes. Your great-grandfather chose that name because he believed caring for the needy was a sacred calling." Megan sat down, trying to process the information. "So, I've always worked at the hospital my great-grandfather helped create." "And, Mrs. Martha added, you've defended the principles he fought for, dignified and humane care for all patients, especially the most vulnerable. That's incredible." "Megan," said Mrs. Martha, taking her hands, "I don't believe in coincidences. I believe you were destined to be here at this moment to protect patients who couldn't protect themselves." "Mrs. Martha, and now as supervisor, you'll be able to implement changes that will benefit hundreds of patients in the coming years." At that moment, Simon entered the room carrying flowers. "Mom, I brought your favorite flowers," he said, then noticed Megan. "Megan, heard about your promotion. Congratulations." "Thanks, Dr. Simon." "Actually, I have a proposal for you," Simon said. "How about we create a joint program between cardiology and geriatrics? Many elderly people have heart problems, and it would be interesting to have specific protocols." "That would be wonderful," said Megan. "And I can help with the academic side," Mrs. Martha added. "I can research the best global practices in geriatric care." "Mum, are you sure you want to get involved with hospital work again?" "Simon," Mrs. Martha said firmly, "I spent 40 years teaching. I'm not going to stop just because I changed my teaching area." "So we're all in agreement?" Megan asked. "We'll work together to improve care for the elderly." "Absolutely," Simon said. "Definitely," Mrs. Martha said. 2 months later, the program was running perfectly. The geriatric wing had been renovated with brighter colors, spaces for recreational activities, and modern physical therapy equipment. Megan had implemented a protocol where each elderly patient received a psychological evaluation in addition to the medical one, ensuring emotional aspects were considered in treatment. Mrs. Martha had become a volunteer consultant, giving lectures on dignity in old age to both staff and patients' families. Simon had created an outpatient clinic specialized in geriatric cardiology, which was already being replicated by other hospitals in the region. On a Friday afternoon, Megan was finishing her shift when she received an unexpected visit. It was Dr. Bennett, accompanied by a well-dressed man she didn't recognize. "Megan," said Dr. Bennett, "let me introduce Mr. Douglas Miller, President of the Regional Health Board." "Pleasure to meet you, Nurse Mitchell," said the man, extending his hand. "I came personally to see the program you developed here." "I hope you liked what you saw," said Megan. "More than liked it. I'm impressed." Mr. Douglas sat down. "The results are remarkable. a 60% decrease in cases of depression among elderly patients, a 40% reduction in hospitalization time, and an 85% increase in family satisfaction. "We achieved this through teamwork," said Megan modestly. "That's why I'm here. We want you to present this program at a national geriatrics conference. And afterward, we'd like you to help implement similar programs in other hospitals across the state." Megan looked at Dr. Bennett, surprised. "Does that mean—" "It means your work is being recognized nationally," said Dr. Bennett proudly, "and that you'll have the opportunity to help elderly patients in dozens of other hospitals. But I've never spoken at a conference." "Don't worry," said Mr. Douglas. "The presentation will be done as a team. Dr. Simon will present the medical part, Mrs. Martha the academic part, and you the practical nursing part. Mrs. Martha is going to present too." "Of course," laughed Dr. Bennett. "Did you think we could stop a retired university professor from talking about her favorite project?" At that moment, as if she had heard her name, Mrs. Martha appeared at the door. She was wearing an elegant dress and carrying a folder of documents. "Megan," she said excitedly, "did you hear the news? I just found out. I'm so excited. It's been years since I attended an academic conference." Mrs. Martha turned to Mr. Douglas. "Are you the president of the board?" "Yes, ma'am." "Great. I have some suggestions about public policies for geriatric care that I'd like to discuss with you." Mr. Douglas seemed slightly intimidated by Mrs. Martha's energy, but he nodded politely. "Mrs. Martha," said Megan, "are you sure you want to get involved in all this? It's going to be a lot of work." "Megan, dear," said Mrs. Martha, taking her hand, "a few months ago I was confused, improperly medicated, treated like a burden. Today I'm researching, writing, teaching again. You gave me back my life and my dignity. You gave it back to yourself. Not alone. With your help, the help of my son, Dr. Bennett, and all the staff who had the courage to speak up." Mrs. Martha looked around. "This hospital has become an example of how institutions can change when brave people decide to do the right thing. And now," added Dr. Bennett, "we're going to take this change to other places." Mr. Douglas stood up. "Well, I'll leave you to organize yourselves. The conference is in 3 months. Until then, keep up the excellent work." After he left, the four of them were silent for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of what had happened. "Do you realize," said Simon finally, "that we started all this just trying to protect my mother from an abusive administrator? And now we're creating a national model of humanized care," Megan added. "That's what happens," said Mrs. Martha wisely, "when people refuse to accept injustice as normal." "Professor Martha," said Dr. Bennett affectionately, "you taught me that 20 years ago, remember? Always question, always seek evidence, never accept authority without foundation." "And you applied those lessons magnificently," replied Mrs. Martha proudly. That night, Megan went home with mixed feelings of exhaustion and euphoria. She called her children, who lived with their father in another city, to share the news. "Mom," her older son said, "did you become a famous person?" Megan laughed. "Not famous, son. Just a nurse who was lucky to work with very special people." "Are you going to travel to that conference?" "Yes, I am, and afterwards maybe you can come live with me again. With my new salary, I can rent a bigger house." "Really?" her daughter asked excitedly. "Really? And you'll love meeting Mrs. Martha. She said she wants to meet you and tell stories about our ancestors." After hanging up the phone, Megan sat in her small living room and reflected on everything that had happened. In just a few months, her life had completely changed. She thought of her great-grandfather, Professor Anthony Mitchell, who had dreamed of a hospital where everyone was treated with dignity. He could never have imagined that his great-granddaughter would continue his legacy decades later. She thought of Mrs. Martha, who had turned a traumatic experience into motivating strength to help other elderly people. She thought of Dr. Simon, who had found the courage to face his fears and become an even stronger advocate for his patients. And she thought of herself, a nurse who just tried to do what she thought was right and ended up changing not just one hospital, but potentially influencing medical care across the entire state. 3 months later, On the day of the National Geriatrics Conference, Megan was nervous backstage at the main auditorium. There were over 500 healthcare professionals in the audience. "Megan," said Simon, appearing by her side, "how are you feeling?" "Terrified," she admitted. "What if I forget what to say?" "You won't forget," said Mrs. Martha, approaching elegantly dressed in a navy blue suit. "You're going to talk about what you know best, caring for people." "Mrs. Martha, aren't you nervous?" "Dear, I've presented academic papers for 40 years. This is my natural element," the elderly woman laughed. "By the way, I changed some slides in our presentation. I included data on the economic impact of humanized care." "What kind of data?" asked Dr. Simon. "Patients who receive humanized care have faster recovery, fewer complications, lower need for readmission. Economically, this represents millions in savings for the healthcare system." "Perfect," said Dr. Bennett, arriving with Mr. Douglas. "With solid economic arguments, it will be easier to convince other administrators to implement similar programs." "It's time," announced Mr. Douglas. "Are you ready?" Megan took a deep breath. "We are." The presentation was a complete success. Dr. Simon explained the medical aspects clearly, Mrs. Martha impressed the audience with solid academic data, and Megan moved everyone by describing specific cases of patients who had benefited from the program. During the Q&A session, a doctor from New York stood up. "Nurse Mitchell," he said, "your program requires significant initial investment. How to convince administrators focused only on cost-cutting?" "Doctor," replied Megan, remembering Mrs. Martha's advice about presenting evidence. "Our program not only pays for itself within a year, but also generates substantial savings. Patients treated humanely have 40% less chance of developing complications that require expensive treatment." "Furthermore," added Mrs. Martha, "humanized care reduces staff turnover. Training new employees costs much more than keeping satisfied and motivated employees." The audience applauded, and several people came forward afterwards to ask for implementation details. At the end of the day, when they were celebrating at the hotel, Dr. Menezes made a toast to Megan Mitchell, who had the courage to defend an elderly woman when no one else would. "To Mrs. Martha," replied Megan, "who turned suffering into wisdom and is using that wisdom to help others. To Dr. Simon," added Mrs. Martha, "who found the strength to face the past and build a better future. And to Dr. Bennett," said Simon, "who taught us that questioning inappropriate authority is the responsibility of every ethical professional." "And," said a familiar voice from the restaurant door, "to all of you, who proved that determined people can change the world." It was Mr. Douglas, accompanied by an elegant woman. "Mr. Douglas," said Megan, "we didn't expect to see you here. I couldn't miss the celebration," he said with a smile, "especially because I have news. Allow me to introduce Dr. Susan Carter, the State Secretary of Health." The woman approached the group. "It's a pleasure to meet you in person," she said. "Your presentation today was inspiring." "Thank you," said Megan. "Actually, I came to make an official proposal. The state wants to fund the implementation of your program in 20 public hospitals over the next 2 years. The group fell silent, processing the information. "20 hospitals?" asked Dr. Simon. "To start. If the results are similar to yours, we'll expand to all public hospitals in the state." "That would mean," began Megan. "Thousands of elderly people receiving dignified, humanized care," completed Mrs. Martha, her eyes shining. "And," added Dr. Susan, "you would be the program coordinators. Naturally, with salaries commensurate with the responsibility." Megan looked at her friends. In less than a year, they had gone from a nurse defending an elderly woman to coordinators of a state program. "We accept," she said, speaking for the group. "Great," said Dr. Susan. "I'll send the contracts next week." After the officials left, the group was silent for a moment. "Do you believe what's happening?" asked Simon finally. "I believe it," said Mrs. Martha with a serene smile. "I believe it because I saw how it started. I saw a young nurse put herself between a helpless elderly woman and a cruel woman. Everything else was a natural consequence of that initial courage." "Mrs. Martha," said Megan, Can I ask you something? Of course. When you were confused from the medications, did you realize what was happening? Mrs. Martha thought carefully before answering. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. There were moments of clarity when I understood something was wrong, but I couldn't express it or do anything about it. She paused, gently touching Megan's arm. That's why your courage was so important. You were my voice when I couldn't use my own. And now you're the voice of thousands of other elderly people, said Dr. Bennett. We are, corrected Mrs. Martha. This project is ours, not mine. 1 year later, the program was running in 15 hospitals, with the remaining 5 in the process of implementation. The results were even better than expected. Megan was in her new office in the state capital, reviewing reports from the different hospitals, when she received a surprise visit. "Excuse me," said a voice at the door. "Nurse Mitchell." Megan looked up and saw a young woman, about 25 years old, in a nurse's uniform. "Yes, can I help you?" "My name is Chloe Brooks. I work at Mercy General Hospital in Columbus. I came to thank you in person." "Thank me? For what?" Chloe sat down, her eyes full of emotion. "Because of your program, I was able to save my grandmother. She was being mistreated at another hospital, medicated with unnecessary drugs, treated like a burden." The young woman paused to hold back her tears. "When we implemented your protocol at Mercy General, I transferred her there. In 2 weeks, she was back to being the strong woman she had always been." Megan felt her heart warm. "I'm so glad to hear that, Chloe. But there's more," the young nurse continued. "Your example inspired me to question other irregular situations. I discovered that some diabetic patients weren't receiving proper medication due to administrative savings. I reported the situation, and we managed to fix it." "That's great!" "Nurse Mitchell," said Chloe, leaning forward, "you have no idea how many people are being inspired by your story. Nurses all over the state are finding the courage to stand up for patients because they saw that it's possible to make a difference." Megan was moved. She had never thought her initial action could inspire others so broadly. "Chloe, can I ask you a favor?" "Of course." "Keep doing what you're doing. Keep advocating for patients, questioning irregularities, fighting for compassionate care, and whenever possible, inspire others to do the same." "You can count on it," said Chloe with a determined smile. "I learned from the best." That evening, Megan called Mrs. Martha to tell her about the visit. "Megan," said the elderly woman's lively voice on the phone, "how was your day?" "Inspiring. I got a visit from a young nurse who said our story inspired her to stand up for her own grandmother." "How wonderful. You know, dear, that's exactly what education should be, inspiring people to become better versions of themselves." "How is your book coming along?" "Finished. And I already have a publisher interested. It's going to be called Dignity in Aging, Lessons of Resilience and Renewal." Perfect title. "And Megan, I dedicated the book to you." Megan felt tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Martha, you saved me, dear. Not just from the wrong medications or the mistreatment. You saved me from hopelessness. You showed me my life still had purpose. You did the same for me. You taught me that one person can truly make a difference in the world. And now look, entire hospitals are changing. Thousands of elderly are receiving dignified care. Young professionals are being inspired. It all started with you stepping between me and a cruel woman." 2 years after the conference, Megan was walking through the hallways of St. Jude Medical Center. She was making a surprise visit to see how the original program was doing. What she saw made her proud. The geriatric ward was bright and cheerful, with patients taking part in recreational activities, family members smiling, staff clearly satisfied with their work. She went to Mrs. Martha's old room, which was now used as a lounge for patients. Inside, she found a scene that made her smile. Mrs. Martha, now 78 years old, was telling stories to a group of 5 elderly people who listened intently. "And then," said Mrs. Martha, "the young nurse stood right in front of me and said, 'You cannot treat an elderly woman like that.' She really had guts," remarked a white-haired lady. "She did. And do you know why she had that courage?" Why, Mrs. Martha? Because she understood something important. When we see injustice and do nothing, we become part of the injustice. Megan gently knocked on the door. "Excuse me, may I interrupt?" "Megan!" exclaimed Mrs. Martha, getting up quickly. "Everyone, meet the heroine of the story I was telling." The elderly people applauded and Megan blushed with embarrassment. "Mrs. Martha, you're exaggerating." "No, I'm not." Mrs. Martha came closer and hugged her. "How are things in Washington, D.C.? Very well, the program is already running in 18 hospitals, and the results continue to be excellent. And your children? Great. They moved here last month. They are loving the new school and can't wait to meet you in person." "And I can't wait to meet them," said Mrs. Martha excitedly. They talked for another hour, updating each other about their lives and work. When Megan was getting ready to leave, Mrs. Martha called her aside. "Megan, can I tell you a secret?" "Of course." "Remember when you asked me if I noticed what was happening when I was confused from the medication?" "I remember. I didn't tell you the whole truth that day." Megan looked at her curiously. "What do you mean?" "I noticed more than I admitted, especially in the last few days before you stepped in." Mrs. Martha lowered her voice. "Actually, I was pretending to be more confused than I really was." "Pretending? Why?" "Because I wanted to understand what Victoria was doing. I wanted evidence." Mrs. Martha's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Once a teacher, always a teacher. She never stops investigating." "You were gathering information?" "Trying to. But it was getting difficult because the medication was really affecting me." Mrs. Martha held Megan's hand. "That's why your intervention was so crucial. You showed up right when I was losing the ability to defend myself." "Mrs. Martha, you are amazing." "No more amazing than a young nurse who risked everything to protect a stranger." Megan hugged the elderly woman affectionately. "I have to go, but I promise to come back next week with my children. I'll be waiting." "And Megan?" "Yes? Thank you. For everything." As Megan walked back to the parking lot, she reflected on Mrs. Martha's revelation. The elderly woman had been more aware and resilient than anyone imagined. It made her realize something important. Sometimes people who seem most vulnerable are actually stronger than they appear. She thought of all the other Marthas who must exist in hospitals across the country, people seen as frail or troublesome when in fact they were just misunderstood or mistreated. Her phone rang. It was Dr. Simon. "Megan, how was the visit to the hospital?" "Very good. Your mother is still amazing." "I know," laughed Simon. "She called me yesterday saying she wants to expand the recreational activities program. Apparently she has ideas to include music and visual arts." "Great idea." "Megan, I have news. Remember Victoria?" Megan felt a chill down her spine upon hearing the name. What happened to her? She was convicted. 3 years in prison for fraud and mistreatment of the elderly. Plus, she can never work in healthcare institutions again. "That's good," said Megan, feeling a mix of satisfaction and relief. "But there's more. During the trial, we discovered that she had done similar things in other hospitals before coming to St. Jude Medical Center." "Other hospitals?" "At least 4. Her scheme was always the same. She got an administrative position, identified employees with some weakness to blackmail, and then implemented economies that were actually frauds." "How many patients did she harm over the years?" "Hundreds, probably." Simon's voice became serious. "That's why our work is so important, Megan. We didn't just save my mother. We prevented dozens of other patients from being harmed, and we created a model that will protect thousands of people." "When you put it that way, that's exactly how it should be put. You weren't just a courageous nurse. You were a force for systemic change." After hanging up the phone, Megan drove slowly through the streets of Indianapolis. It was a city she loved, where she was born and raised, where she intended to raise her children. She passed by the school where her children would study, the park where she would play with them on weekends, the library where Mrs. Martha had researched her family history. Her life had changed completely in 2 years, but in a way she was still the same person, someone who couldn't stand still when she saw injustice. The difference was that now she had resources, authority, and a platform to make changes on a much larger scale. Her phone rang again. It was a message from Chloe Brooks, the young nurse from Columbus. Megan, I just got promoted to supervisor of the pediatric ward. I'm going to implement humanized care protocols for hospitalized children. Thank you for inspiring me to fight for patients. Megan smiled. The chain of positive change continued to spread, touching lives she would never directly know. She thought of her great-grandfather, Professor Anthony Mitchell, who had dreamed of dignified care for everyone. Could he have imagined that his great-granddaughter would continue his legacy in such an amplified way? Probably not. But perhaps that's exactly how real change happened. Not through grand plans or complicated strategies, but through ordinary people doing the right thing at the right time. A nurse standing up for an elderly woman sharing wisdom, a doctor finding courage, a medical director supporting what's right, young professionals being inspired to make a difference. Real change, one person at a time. The following year, Megan was invited to speak at an international geriatric care conference in London. It was her first time leaving the United States, and she was nervous but excited. The presentation was an even bigger success than the national one. Delegates from 15 countries expressed interest in implementing adapted versions of the American program. During the closing dinner, Megan sat next to a geriatric doctor from Norway. "Nurse Mitchell," said the doctor, "your story is inspiring, but I have a question." "Sure." "What made you make that initial decision to stand up for Mrs. Martha? Many people would have simply walked by or stayed quiet." Megan thought carefully before answering. "I think it was a combination of factors. My family upbringing, my experience as a nurse, and something deeper." "What else?" "The certainty that if it were my grandmother, my mother, or myself in the future, I would want someone to have the courage to stand up for me." The Norwegian doctor nodded thoughtfully. "In other words, basic empathy." "Basic empathy," repeated Megan. "Maybe it really is that simple." "But if it's so simple, why do so few people do it?" "Because basic empathy requires courage, and courage has consequences. I could have lost my job. I could have gotten into trouble." Megan paused. "But not acting also has consequences, and I couldn't live with the consequences of not trying to help." The doctor smiled. "I'll take your words back to my team in Norway. I think sometimes we forget that medicine and nursing are fundamentally about the courage to care." 3 years after the initial incident, Megan was at home preparing dinner when her children came home from school. "Mom!" shouted Caleb, her 12-year-old son. "You won't believe what happened today." "What?" "The history teacher was talking about people who made a difference in the world, and a girl in my class said you were an example." Megan almost dropped the pan. "What do you mean?" "Her grandmother is admitted at the hospital in Columbus and is being treated really well because of your program," explained Maya, her 10-year-old daughter. "The girl said her grandmother tells everyone how you saved the elderly of the United States." "I didn't save the elderly of the United States," said Megan, sitting down at the table with her kids. "I just tried to help one person who needed it." "But Mom," said Caleb, "the teacher said that big changes start with small actions, and that you are an example of how an ordinary person can make an extraordinary difference." "Everyone can make a difference," said Megan. "You can too when you grow up." "We already do," said Maya excitedly. "Today I stood up for a boy who was being picked on at school. And I helped a girl who had forgotten her lunch," added Caleb. Megan smiled, proud. Her children were learning the same lessons she had learned. Small acts of courage and kindness make a difference. "Mom," said Caleb, "can you tell us again how it all started?" "You've heard this story 1,000 times, but we like hearing it," said Maya. "And now that we know Mrs. Martha personally, it's even better." Megan leaned back in her chair and began telling the story once more. But this time she noticed something different about the way she told it. It was no longer the story of a brave nurse saving a helpless elderly woman. It was the story of ordinary people discovering extraordinary strength when they unite for a just cause. It was the story of Mrs. Martha, who, even though she had been inadequately medicated, kept her dignity and wisdom. It was the story of Dr. Simon, who found the courage to face his past and become an even stronger advocate. It was the story of Dr. Bennett, who used his authority to protect what was right. It was the story of hospital employees who risked their jobs to defend patients. It was the story of young professionals inspired to make a difference in their own institutions. And yes, it was also the story of a nurse who couldn't stay silent in the face of injustice, but most of all, it was the story of how real change happens, through ordinary people making extraordinary choices. 5 years after the initial incident, Megan received a special invitation. St. Jude Medical Center was organizing a dedication ceremony for a new wing, the Professor Anthony Mitchell Center of Excellence in Geriatric Care. The center was being named in honor of her great-grandfather, and she had been invited as the main speaker for the ceremony. On the day of the dedication, Megan arrived at the hospital accompanied by her children, now teenagers, and was moved by the number of people present. There were current and former hospital employees, patients and their families, professionals from other hospitals, local and state authorities, and journalists. But what moved her most was seeing Mrs. Martha, now 82 years old, sitting in the front row, dressed elegantly and holding a folder, always a folder with some new project. The ceremony began with Dr. Bennett, now the hospital's general director, telling the story of the Humanized Care program. Then it was Simon's turn, who spoke about the personal and professional transformation the experience had brought him. Mrs. Martha spoke about the importance of seeing the elderly as complex individuals with rich histories, not just as patients. Finally, it was Megan's turn. She approached the microphone and looked at the audience. She recognized many faces. Chloe was there, now the nursing coordinator at her hospital, several employees who had had the courage to speak up against Victoria, patients who had benefited from the program, young professionals who had been inspired by the story. When I stepped between Mrs. Martha and a cruel administrator 5 years ago, Megan began, I wasn't thinking about systemic change, national programs, or centers of excellence. I was simply thinking that a 77-year-old lady deserved to be treated with dignity. Today, looking at all of you, I realize that simple decision touched something fundamental, our responsibility toward one another. Everyone here today has been part of this change. Employees who had the courage to speak up, doctors who questioned inadequate practices, administrators who prioritized care over profit, young professionals who were inspired to make a difference. The Professor Anthony Mitchell Center is not just a new building. It is a symbol that when ordinary people decide to do the right thing, extraordinary changes happen. My great-grandfather dreamed of a hospital where everyone would be treated with dignity. Today, that dream has come true, not only here, but in dozens of hospitals across the country. But more important than the numbers, the statistics, or the awards we have received is the fact that thousands of people, patients, families, professionals, have been touched by a simple idea. Taking care of one another is everyone's responsibility. Mrs. Martha taught me that education is about inspiring people to become better versions of themselves. I hope our story inspires you to find the courage to stand up for what is right, even when it is hard. Because in the end, no matter your profession or position in life, if you see injustice and have the power to do something about it, you have the responsibility to act. Thank you. The audience rose to a prolonged applause. Megan saw tears in many people's eyes, including her own. After the ceremony, during the reception, Mrs. Martha approached Megan. What a wonderful speech, dear. I learned from the best teacher, Megan replied, hugging the elderly woman. Megan, can I tell you a secret? Always. I'm writing another book. About what? About you. About all of us. About how ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Mrs. Martha smiled mysteriously. I even have the title, The Nurse Who Changed a System, Lessons in Courage and Compassion. Mrs. Martha, you don't have to... Yes, I do. This story needs to be told to inspire others. And, she winked, I already have an interested publisher. Megan laughed. Mrs. Martha was still the same force of nature as always. And there's one more thing, Mrs. Martha continued. What? The hospital in Toronto contacted me. They want to implement our program there. And guess who they want as a consultant? You? Us. The whole team. Mrs. Martha picked up her folder and took out some papers. I've already started planning the adaptation of the program for the Canadian reality. Megan shook her head in admiration. At 82, Mrs. Martha was still planning new projects and adventures. "You never stop, do you?" "Dear," said Mrs. Martha with a knowing smile, "when you discover you still have purpose in life, there's no reason to stop." That night, Megan was at home reflecting on the day when she received a WhatsApp message. It was from an unknown number. "Hi, Nurse Megan, my name is Marcos. I'm a nursing assistant in Fortaleza. Today, I saw the report about the opening of the center in Indianapolis. I want you to know that your story inspired me to report mistreatment of elderly patients at my hospital. It was hard, but we succeeded. Thank you for giving me courage." Megan smiled and replied, "Thank you for having the courage to do what was right. Every time someone like you acts, the world becomes a little better." She received 3 more similar messages that night, and another 5 the next day. Apparently, her story had spread far beyond what she imagined, inspiring people across the country to take action in their own realities. A week later, she was organizing papers in her office when Dr. Bennett appeared. "Megan, I have a proposal for you. Go ahead. The Department of Health and Human Services wants to create a national program based on our model. They are offering you the general coordination." Megan was silent for a moment. "Would it be national, the whole country?" "The whole country, over 5,000 public hospitals." Dr. Bennett sat down. "It would be a chance to multiply by 1,000 the impact of what we've done." "And would I have to move to Washington, D.C.? "Probably, at least during the implementation phase." Megan thought about her children, her established life in Indianapolis, about Mrs. Martha and the entire team she worked with. "Can I bring my team with me?" "Of course, in fact, they're counting on it." "And Mrs. Martha?" Dr. Bennett laughed. "You think you could stop Mrs. Martha from taking part in a national project to improve geriatric care?" "That's true," Megan laughed. "So what do you think?" Megan looked out the window of her office. She could see the hospital courtyard where it all began 5 years ago. She remembered the first time she saw Mrs. Martha being mistreated, the decision to intervene, all the consequences that followed. She remembered the words she had said that very first moment. "You cannot treat an elderly woman like that." 5 years later, she had the chance to say that to an entire country. "I accept," she said. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this inspiring story and where you're watching us from. If you have any similar experience to share with us, leave it in the comments with sincere words. Do you believe that Megan always made the right decisions? We would love to read your opinion. Thank you very much for your company. Don't forget to leave your like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other exciting stories.